So now in our continuation of our lectures on Egypt and Nubia, let's look at the relationship to Egypt and other parts of Africa and the Middle East. Egypt was very fortunate not only to have the flooding of the Nile, but also very important proximity to other major civilizations that provided trade and other technologies and developed technologies continuing to help it kind of flourish during this time. The Egyptian Empire included a region up in the further upper regions of the Nile called Nubia. And the relations between Egypt and Nubia were very important about the sort of dynastic continuity of Egypt and the extraordinary changes that were going on in the sort of Nubian politics and self-identity. So when we look at the art, the most ancient art of Egypt and Nubia, we see a kind of violent oppressor images of the Egyptians toward the Nubians. They're depicted as short, squat prisoners who have been violently overthrown and enslaved. Here we see the decorated battlefield palette, late pre-dynastic period, about 3100 BCE. This is a very extraordinary object, and unfortunately, nobody's quite sure what they were used for. They seem to be based on a kind of standard tool that people would use to paint their faces. There's a kind of disc in the center of the stone which had been polished smooth, and in there makeup would be prepared and then painted onto the skin. Now, why was this iconography included on this tool? What significance did this have to the people who were, one, painting the faces of the pharaohs and their family, or somebody who was being painted? For whom was this intended? What were these messages about? And that's a question no one has really been able to satisfactorily answer. There just isn't enough known. This kind of art is relatively early in the Egyptian period. And there are a few of them, and they usually sort of evoke this kind of powerful degradation of the Nubians. But we also see that in the palette of Narmer, which is a little bit better preserved, and you can start to see here what a complete palette might look like. And again, we see the subjugation of and humiliation of the Nubians being held by the hair. Another interesting feature we see in the palette of Narmer is this sort of upper portion of this palette includes these human-faced bulls. There are the horned bulls of Hathor, the goddess there of fertility, resting on the very top of the palette. So clearly this is an important symbol, a sign of royal privilege and prestige. But it's interesting the degree to which there was this kind of excess of an exhibition of these symbols. Here we can see in a depiction of the drawing of on there, typically the depiction of the Nubians were as very dark-skinned people who had very negroid features, flat noses, and smaller framed bodies. And in the stylization that they are rendered in much more naturalistically, so that if you look at the artwork of representing Nubians, they seem like a completely different kind of person. Interestingly enough, as genetic information about the people in the regions suggests that they did not look so very different than the Egyptians, that it's the Egyptians who sort of exaggerated this difference as a means for sort of justifying their subjugation of these people. Nubia was a very important place for trade. They were not just employed as slaves. Nubian ceramics was considered some of the finest ceramics in the region, and they created these two-tone Kerma-style ceramics, which are so well made, then with these very distinctive white band around the center, that nobody really knows how they actually achieve this distinctive firing technique. And so these kinds of vessels were highly prized in Egypt. We also know that inside the main pyramid, the stone that is right above the pharaoh's head is this massive piece of marble from Nubia that was hauled all the way down and into the pyramid. Again, this idea of linking the land in Nubia to the pharaoh's legitimacy was a very important part of the symbolism of the pharaoh cult. One very interesting change happens, aside from all the great continuity that was brought about in Egyptian art. There's a period called the New Kingdom, where this pharaoh named Akhenaten, who ruled from about 1353, 1336 BCE. And in this, he instituted a number of very dramatic changes, where he tried to diminish the significance of the priesthood and sort of create a kind of different cult of the pharaoh, eliminate a lot of the gods, and start to have people worship the one God of the sun, to create a kind of monotheism. And so this sun god, Aten, this is actually one of the earliest examples we have of monotheism in the world. And it's very interesting that it should happen at this time. He also adopted a very new style of art. We'll start talking about that, this way in which Akhenaten wanted to introduce faces which were and figures which were not so idealized, where his own personal physical traits would be visible. So we see here a lot of depictions of the pharaoh's family and his children here worshiping the sun, and we see the sun disk and little rays coming down, touching and blessing all things. And so this was a way of kind of creating this idea of the singular, all-powerful deity that he directly felt he was related to. Here you can see in a very interesting broken piece of a statue, remains of a statue, the stylization of the lips and mouth and chin, and the flatness of the nose. And very interestingly, this sort of crease that extends from the nose out around the corner of the mouth. This is called the nasal labial. And the fact that this is sort of distinguished in this way might be a way of sort of indicating that he was trying to suggest that he had more of an affinity with the Nubians in his physical manner. Okay, this is a kind of feature that would not have been shown or seen on earlier pharaohs. So we look at the depictions of the royal family. We find this really striking statue of Nefertiti with this extended long neck. Now, there's been some question about this statue because it's very remarkable and very unique. It was probably a statue that was used as a model for artworks. So they would have the statue, and then people who were carving reliefs in the walls or making other art, this would be kind of a model. The reason why they think it's a model and not a finished work of art is that one of the eyes is not complete, which is rather striking. That would be a kind of heresy to have a statue of the wife of the pharaoh that was somehow incomplete. So it's sort of believed that it was not intended to be a part of the kind of royal household, but it was maybe something that was used in the making of other art. So the New Kingdom, a lot of the art we have from the New King is terribly battered and broken. Nefertiti and a lot of her images for her and all the statues have been largely destroyed, as it was severely rejected by the priesthood. And after his death, there was an overthrow of this idea of monotheism and a kind of return, and again, this very conservative idea of the sort of maintenance of these multitude of gods and deities. Now, another interesting piece of art I wanted to point out here were these idea of servants called shaptis, and they can be found in tombs along with all kinds of other actual mummified remains of not only servants and animals and pets to keep the pharaoh company, as their body is also entombed and preserved in this vast sort of necropolis of all kinds of wealth was being poured into these things. But these servant figures, this is where sort of to ensure the loyalty of the servants, they stopped killing large numbers of servants to go, and they instead put these sort of token servants, these little statues of servants made out of simple clay or wood, and they would be the helpers. So the pharaoh in the next life would not have to kind of, do their own laundry or prepare their own food. These little statues would be there to kind of intercede and help the pharaoh in the afterlife. And so the Shabtis are really interesting. We see the way in which there are sort of inscriptions from the Book of the Dead written on the bodies of the servants. Now, the one on the left is a sort of a classic style of the Shabtis, fairly small, rather innocuous looking. Interestingly enough, there's quite a lot of these Shabtis from the Taharqa, who was a Nubian pharaoh who actually came in and overthrew the kingdom of Egypt and ruled for a time in Egypt and restored many of the sort of ancient traditions that had been going on during this time. So it's a chance to look at the way in which Nubia was able to sort of throw off its position as a subservient kingdom and actually assert itself and rule all of Egypt for a time. So Taharqa was a ruler who ruled between 690 and 664 BCE. He had a very interesting and distinctive character to his work. You see his Taharqa Sphinx and all of his Shabtis. His Shabtis were not sort of uniform and generic looking. They're actually made of a number of different, more highly prized and rare materials. And their faces all seem to suggest greater individuality. So were they actually based on really real people? It's hard to say. So this is a very interesting way in which a very different, distinctive style of Taharqa's reign that he brought to bear on his kingdom when he ruled over Egypt. They also sort of were more conservative in the sense that they were trying to sort of outshine the traditions of Egypt. Many of the burial practices of the kings of the pharaohs of Egypt had fallen away or become corrupted. And sort of as a sort of demonstration of their knowledge of these ancient ways, they sort of corrected and enhanced and brought back many of the sort of ancient traditions that had worked in the past. Here you can see in Meroe in the Nubian kingdom, one of the largest pyramids, a collection of pyramids that were made for the kings and queens of Nubia. They were constructed at about 3 different sites over a period of a few hundred years. There's a total of about 255 pyramids in these regions. The physical proportions of Nubian pyramids differ from Egyptian pyramids. They're built very steeply. They have a kind of much more narrower base, and they only rise to about between 20 and 100 feet in height. So there's a very like a steep sort of 70-degree angle. Now, they don't look very impressive, but unfortunately a lot of these were badly damaged in the 19th century by European treasure hunters. In our next lecture in this series, we're going to talk more about the battle for the Rosetta Stone and what that says about the need to know about Egypt and the neglect of Nubia.